We have a very specific idea of what intelligence looks like. It looks like problem solving, tool use, the ability to plan ahead, to communicate in abstract symbols, to recognize yourself in a mirror. It looks, in other words, like us, or like the animals we've decided are most similar to us. Everything else gets filed under instinct, reflex, hardwired behavior that happens without anything we'd recognize as thought. Dinosaurs, in most people's mental model, are firmly in that second category. Big bodies, small brains, doing what evolution programmed them to do without anything happening in between the stimulus and the response. But that model was built on a measurement, a single, simple ratio that scientists used for decades to rank animal intelligence. And that measurement, it turns out, was almost certainly wrong, and wrong in a direction that makes the dinosaurs look considerably more interesting than we ever gave them credit for. The obvious assumption is that brain size determines intelligence. Bigger brain, smarter animal. And since most dinosaurs had brains that were, relative to their body size, smaller than those of modern mammals, the conclusion seemed obvious. They were less intelligent. But that's not the right question. Brain size relative to body mass, what scientists call the encephalization quotient, or EQ, was the standard metric for most of the 20th century. The better question is, what does brain size actually measure? And how much of intelligence does it capture? Because in the last 2 decades, neuroscience has largely abandoned EQ as a reliable proxy for cognitive capacity. And what replaced it changes the dinosaur picture in ways that most popular accounts of prehistoric life have not yet caught up with. In 2016, neuroscientist Susanna Herculano-Husel, whose work on neuron counting had already overturned assumptions about primate intelligence, published research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining what actually predicts cognitive capacity across species. Her finding was specific. It's not brain size, and it's not the ratio of brain to body, it's neuron density. The number of neurons packed into a given volume of brain tissue, and particularly the number in the regions responsible for learning, memory, and behavioral flexibility. What this revealed about birds, the living descendants of theropod dinosaurs, was striking. Corvids and parrots have forebrain neuron densities comparable to primates, packed into brains a fraction of the size. A crow the size of a lemon has roughly the same number of neurons in its associative brain regions as a macaque monkey. The architecture is different. The processing power is not. And here is where the dinosaur connection becomes direct. The avian brain is not a simplified version of the mammalian brain. It is a different solution to the same problem, one that evolved from the theropod lineage and retains structural features that were already present in non-avian dinosaurs. The neural foundations for complex learning and behavioral flexibility were being laid in the Mesozoic, not fully developed, not at crow level, but present, functional, and more capable than the EQ numbers ever suggested. Start with what we know about theropod behavior from the fossil record. Deinonychus, the animal that Jurassic Park's velociraptors were actually based on, scaled up for dramatic effect, hunted in groups. We know this from fossil assemblages. Multiple Deinonychus individuals found alongside single large prey animals in configurations that don't make sense as coincidence. Coordinated hunting requires the ability to track other individuals, adjust behavior in real time, and respond to what others in the group are doing. That's not instinct, that's social cognition. Now think about nesting behavior. In the 1970s, paleontologist Jack Horner discovered a nesting site in Montana that changed everything. Maiasaura, a large hadrosaur, had returned to the same nesting ground across multiple seasons. Parent animals had brought food to juveniles too young to leave the nest. The juveniles showed worn teeth consistent with being fed, not foraging. That is parental investment. Extended care. Behavior that requires memory of the nest location, recognition of offspring, and the sustained motivation to provision them over weeks or months. But here's what's really interesting. In 2023, a study in the Journal of Comparative Neurology examined the brain endocast's internal skull impressions that preserve the shape of the brain of multiple non-avian dinosaur species and found evidence of enlarged regions associated with olfactory processing, spatial memory, and in theropods, specifically visual integration areas structurally similar to those in modern raptorial birds. These weren't mammalian brains. But they weren't the undifferentiated, reflex-driven organs the old models assumed either. They were specialized, different regions handling different tasks. The beginning of the architecture that, 66 million years later, lets a crow remember the face of a person who wronged it 3 years ago. The dinosaurs were not as smart as a crow, but they were considerably smarter than a crocodile. And the crocodile, which has barely changed in 80 million years, is capable of learned behavior, individual recognition, and problem solving that most people would not predict from an animal we still call primitive. But here's the thing. The reason we underestimated dinosaur intelligence isn't really about the science. It's about the story we needed them to be. A smart dinosaur is a more complicated dinosaur. It makes decisions. It learns from experience. It might, in some limited sense, have preferences and memories and the capacity to be surprised. That version of the dinosaur is harder to process as background scenery for the Mesozoic, harder to feel comfortable about the asteroid. We made them dumb because dumb things disappearing is a simpler story. Dumb things don't have something closer to an inner life. Dumb things are easier to leave behind in the past. The evidence says they weren't dumb, and that changes what their 165 million years on this planet actually means. Not a long reign of biological automatons filling ecological niches. Something with more texture than that. Something that remembered and learned, and in its own limited, ancient, unreachable way figured things out. The next time you watch a crow solve a problem, drop a nut in traffic to crack it. Then, wait for the light to change before retrieving it. You are watching the cognitive heir of 230 million years of theropod evolution. It didn't get that way overnight. Something was already happening in those Mesozoic brains. Something that the asteroid interrupted but didn't erase, because the lineage that carried it forward was already in the air when the rock hit. Intelligence, it turns out, is older than we thought. It was already accumulating, already building, already finding its way towards something. It just took a detour through the end of the world to get here.